Welcome to knowledgeformen.com, where you're going to grow into the man you want to be. Your life will never be the same again. I can guarantee it. The father of personal development, Jim Rohn, said it best. You are the average of the 5 people you spend your most time with. And so I've created a mastermind community called the Lion's Den around this idea that if you are surrounded by high-performing people and you have consistent education and training, then you will succeed in life and as a man. Check out kfmlion.com to learn how the Lion's Den can take your life, relationships, and business to the next level. Again, that's kfmlion.com. All right, guys, welcome to the show. I'm here with Mark Lee Greenblatt. He's an attorney based in Washington, D.C., and the author of Valor, Unsung Heroes from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Home Front. All right, Mark, happy to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a real honor.
All right, I'm excited to have you here. I mean, you've got some stories here of what's happened over there in the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, and a lot of these stories none of us have ever heard of. You know, not everyone got a bestseller book on New York Times. Not everyone has a movie made after them. And, you know, so I'm happy you're here. But before we dive into some of these really, you know, compelling stories, let's start off, as always, with a favorite success quote of yours or a saying that you've lived by, and then go ahead and explain why.
Well, one thing that I learned actually over the course of writing Valor was a saying that one of the guys used to say. It was his personal motto, and it was a Marine grunt, an infantry grunt named James Hassel. And he said that he learned over the course of boot camp and everything that you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And that's something that I thought captured things really well. You know, if you're not doing good things for the world, then maybe you're just a drag on the world. It's time to reconsider what you're doing, on a day-to-day basis. You know, are you adding value or are you not adding value? And I thought that really summed it up well.
Yeah, I like that. I think that really applies to all aspects of life. Like that could be your business, it could be in your career, it could be in relationships.
Absolutely.
Right, and now let's dive into the main topic of this episode, which is your book, Valor, which chronicles the stories of Marines, Army men, Navy SEALs, and really captures the stories from these guys who haven't really shared their stories to the public before. And so I'm interested in why you wrote this book and kind of like how this book came to be, and then let's touch on some of the stories.
Well, I have no military experience. My friends, no friends or family in the military. I always have had great respect for the folks who volunteered to serve. I just never did it, and that was a great regret in life. And I've always respected those folks. And in the 2006-2007 timeframe, I went to these annual awards banquets. And I don't know if you remember back in that time, but the politics around the wars was pretty ugly. And the soldiers were really characterized in a bad way. And I went to these awards banquets where they told these stories, and these stories were just unbelievable. I mean, I'm talking hundreds of people in the audience, and there's not a dry eye in the house. I mean, everyone was just captivated by these stories. And I remember thinking to myself, how come no one knows these men and women? I mean, when they go home, they're going to be, bagging groceries if they're lucky enough to find a job in the first place. In previous generations, we had Audie Murphy, we had Sergeant York, we had Captain Doolittle. I mean, these were heroes. Everyone knew their name. There were ticker tape parades for them. And we got away from that. We don't really have that now. And in 06, 07, I kept saying to myself, how come no one knows these guys? How come no one's telling their stories? And then finally I said, why don't you do it? And that was the start of Valor.
I can relate with the whole not joining the military thing. I think, I so badly would want to go back and look into special forces or something like that. And so, I've always respected the military. And
absolutely.
Right. And I respect the fact that you just took it upon yourself to honor these men for what they did. Otherwise, their story may not have ever been told.
Absolutely. Well, that was it. I mean, I saw this void. I saw the stories that were coming out were out of balance. It was all sort of negative stories. And I knew that there are these positives, thousands of these positive stories going on. And I said, this is the karma is all off here. We've got to figure this out and tell some of these stories. And I do investigations for a living. And so I said, well, this is something like an investigation, finding these stories, writing them up, interviewing the witnesses and everything, and then writing it up in a compelling way. I mean, that's what I do. And so I said, well, why don't you do it? And I just started in one by one by one by one. I mean, it took 5 years, but eventually I got, a book length, number of stories, and a publisher, Roman and Littlefield, God bless them, picked it up, and here we are.
Yeah, right, and here we are. So walk us through now how you went from just hearing about these stories at an event to actually getting in contact with these people, and then on top of that, getting permission from them to share their stories to the world, because I'm sure not all of these guys wanted to do that.
So then I reached out to the charity actually that held the event, and I said, hey, would you mind if I got in contact with some of these folks? And they reached out to them, and a couple of them said yes. And those were my first two stories. And I interviewed those guys. That was Chris Choe and Chris Kyle. And I interviewed them for hours and hours and hours. And I emailed with them, and I talked to witnesses, and I got all kinds of information, and I wrote up their stories. And I said, this is pretty fun. I'm digging this. And then I just started approaching other veterans organizations, and I started looking around on my own. I mean, I live in Washington, D.C., and so, we're close to the Pentagon. There's all kinds of military, organizations around town, and so I started pursuing them and finding stories. And like I said, I treated it like an investigation. I hunted down new stories, and then I would approach the protagonists, the heroes at issue, and I would basically have to cajole them into participating in the project, because not a single one of them, not one, believed they were a hero, and not a single one of them wanted to talk about what they had done overseas. But what I impressed upon them was that, there's this narrative out there in popular culture that you guys are doing bad things over there all the time, and we need to tell some of these positive stories. And I think that actually moved the needle with them, that they wanted to be part of the positive stories. And so what I said was, I'm not telling your story as if you alone are a hero. I'm telling your story as an illustration of the thousands of other stories. And that actually moved the needle. And then the other thing is that I'm actually donating proceeds to military and veterans related charities. And so I think the combination of changing the narrative about what the soldiers and the troops were doing over there, and the donation of the proceeds to charity gave these guys some solace that they weren't just tooting their own horns.
Yeah, I could see that. That's a good approach. And what really just stood out to me when you said not one of these guys believed they were heroes. And, I read the book. So these men did things that saved lives at the risk of their own lives. So why do they believe that they weren't heroes? Just can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, it's a stunning characteristic of all these guys, and I'm talking about the 9 that are profiled in valor, but also the dozens of others that I interviewed, and just the thousands of others that have served. They just refused the label of hero. They were just doing their job. That's what they say. They all deflect credit. They all point to the actions of a colleague. They say, in the middle of our interviews, when I'm talking about these death-defying things that these guys did, these inspirational moments, they say, yeah, what I was doing was cool, but you should have seen what Larry next to me was doing. And, invariably I would ask, well, what was Larry doing? And it was great, but it wasn't what these guys were doing. They just, have a blind spot for their own actions, and it's really admirable. Again, I'm in Washington, and here it's the political capital of the world, and claiming credit for stuff you didn't do, or overselling what you did do, that's our local currency. That's what we do here in Washington. And it's just so refreshing to deal with these guys who are the exact opposite. It's just inspiring to talk with these guys when you see what they did, and then they say, oh, I was just showing up for work, like he was a guy in a construction crew that day. I mean, it's amazing. It's really inspiring.
Yeah, it really is. And let's go ahead and give the audience a better idea of some of the acts of valor that some of these guys did. So can you share one of the stories that you have? And, I know you did quite a few, but just, pick one that you feel would, resonate with the audience.
This is always a difficult question because they're like my children. How do I pick, But I guess the Ranger story, that's Chris Choe. He was in a nasty, nasty firefight in a rural valley in Afghanistan, and it was brutal. His unit was sent down to take out this bunker that was nestled deep in the valley, and he led his squad down. There were 8 guys, and Chris led them down, and there were bullets firing, RPGs firing. He had a couple of his guys get hit on the way down. They said that as they were coming down toward the bunker, the bullets that were fired at them looked like little bugs running through the grass. I mean, it was really just amazing, these moments that they're leading him down there. And Chris finally gets him down about 100 meters away or so, and he sees the bunker, and he sees that the insurgents, there are 4 of them who are shooting, actively shooting, 3 machine guns and an RPG. And he sees that they're vulnerable on their left flank. He sees that they're not paying attention. They're just focusing on what's ahead of them. The problem was Chris was on their right flank. So he had to cross through machine gun crossfire from his own men and from the insurgent bunker to get over to the left flank. It's a pretty incredible thing. He leads his men around, and he gets there, and he's just about to start this assault. He's about 65 meters away, which is in military terms is very, very, very close. And he gets there, and he's just about to lead his men on the assault, and he realizes at that moment that he is all alone. His men didn't hear him as he led the flanking maneuver. So he is there, right up on the precipice, right next to this bunker, all alone. You know, that's an amazing thing in and of itself, but what he does next kicks it up to another level. He sits there and he's ready to take out the bunker by himself. So he raises his rifle, he draws in a breath, and he shoots. And the rifle jams. Think about that moment when he's standing there right next to the insurgent bunker. If they just look to their left, Chris is dead. I mean, they have 3 machine guns and an RPG, and he has 1 jammed rifle. I mean, he is cooked if they look to their left. Now, I don't know about you, but what I would have done in that situation is probably curled up in the fetal position and cried for mommy. I mean, that is, right? I mean, I just can't imagine a worse situation. But not Chris. Chris knelt down, dislodged the jammed round, put in a new magazine, stood up, drew in a breath, and proceeded to take out the entire insurgent bunker, essentially by himself. I mean, that is just an incredible thing. And by the way, after he did that, there were 2 or 3 of the Taliban guys who were still injured. They were still alive. They were injured, but no longer fighting. Chris then started to give them medical treatment to keep them alive. Mind you, these were guys that were shooting, actively shooting at him and injuring his guys just 10 minutes earlier. And here he is actively trying to save their lives. Now, he understood that they would have, intelligence value and things like that. But think about that. I mean, I just can't get my head around that moment when the gun jams and he keeps going and the moment that after all of it is done, he then switches into life-saving mode. Pretty incredible stuff.
Wow, I'm on the edge of my seat, like I'm there right now, Mark. Good storytelling on your part, helping the listeners really feel like we're all there. And I want to comment that in the book, after he destroys that bunker, he then moves forward and continues fighting. There were more insurgents and encounters more where he shoots them and then he throws a grenade inside there and took them out. And when I read it, I was just like, this is something out of a movie. That was what I was thinking.
That's right. I mean, it's something you're like, how does this actually happen? And it's pretty incredible stuff. I mean, this bunker, as I said, there were the 4 shooters on the outside. And as you said, he went one by one and picked them all off. He said as he looked in the crosshairs of his scope on his rifle, they were so close that they looked like they were sitting across a dinner table from him. That's how close they were. And he picked them off one by one. And then he went into the bunker where there were more insurgents. And he went in there and he said he turned the corner into the entrance and he was staring right at an AK. And the guy with the AK shot, stumbled backward and tried to shoot and he missed. But he knew there were guys in there with a lot of weapons. And so he threw a grenade in and that was what ended the fight. But there were 2 guys who survived the grenade. And those are the guys that he treated afterward.
Wow. And, what I remember reading is if his gun had not jammed earlier, then he wouldn't have reloaded and had a full clip. I remember reading that there was only 4 rounds left in that busted clip. So, he would have charged that next group of insurgents with essentially no ammunition.
Absolutely. Or if he had missed one of the 4, one of the first 4, he had only 4. So when it jammed, that actually ended up probably saving his life. I mean, just an amazing turn of events, right? I mean, just the irony of it is it's hard to wrap your mind around. And by the way, I should mention Chris, the guy that we're talking about right now. He is back deployed in Afghanistan right now as we speak, and I just actually exchanged emails with him today, to say hello. And he emailed me back, and he's just so excited about all of this, and just honored to be in the book. And so, I think he'd be a little bit embarrassed that we're telling his story right now.
Well, it deserves to be heard. And so, Mark, what lesson do you want the listeners to walk away with after hearing that story or reading that story?
Well, the big thing is, I would say, is poise in the face of adversity. I mean, or calm under fire. I mean, in that moment, what Chris called the loneliest moment of my life, when his rifle jammed, he stayed calm. He dislodged the round, put in a new magazine, and took out the bunker. I mean, that type of poise is something that you and I, that all of your listeners can incorporate into our lives. That's the sort of thing that we can think back about Chris Choe in that moment, the loneliest moment of his life, when we're about to kick the table because the Wi-Fi is slow, or, when we're about to lose our cool because the line at Starbucks is too long. Think about Chris Choe in that moment when he hears the rifle jam. That should take things down a notch, give us a little bit of perspective on our first world problems. I mean, when some idiot cuts us off in traffic, we need to keep it together. And I would say that, think about Chris Choe. Actually picture Chris Choe in your mind. And by the way, I should mention, on my website, markleygreenblatt.com, there are pictures of Chris and of the actual ambush site, where you can see where these events unfolded. And but I would encourage your listeners to think about that moment when you're about to lose your cool. I do it, and it really recenters me, and gives me that moment of perspective.
Yeah, it really takes it down a notch. And, just thinking about the little things that happen in our day-to-day lives that really bring us down.
Absolutely.
It's like, while we slept in a warm bed last night, someone over there was dodging bullets for us.
Absolutely. And you really realize that your problems are just so first world. This is something I've had to train myself to do, is to actually picture Chris Choe's face, and actually picture the bunker. I mean, when I'm driving, I get irritated just like everybody else, probably worse, actually. But that's something that you train yourself to do. And it really does reframe your mind in that moment, is to think about, that gun jamming, to think about Chris and how he just knelt down, put in the new magazine, and did what he had to do. He didn't freak out. And I think that's something we can learn from.
Yeah, and all of the stories are really compelling, or they're all really good stories that need to be heard.
Absolutely.
But one that stood out to me was Chris Kyle's story, and Chris wrote the book American Sniper, which is a wildly successful book and is now being made into a movie played by Bradley Cooper. But I was hoping that you could share what he did.
Well, Chris's story, I mean, Chris has done so many things, and this story, I'm very thankful that I interviewed Chris when he was a nobody. He was still in the SEALs when I interviewed Chris and wrote up his story. He wrote a book later, and it was very successful, and it's going to be a movie. But he actually didn't tell the story that's in my book, in his own book, because he knew that I was writing about it, and he didn't want to throw me under the bus, he said. And so I appreciated that. This story is just, one of many ridiculous stories that occurred in Chris's life. And basically he was in Fallujah, and he was doing what's called an overwatch mission, which is where they oversee, he and another sniper were sitting on top of rooftops, watching over as the Marines were going in house by house, clearing out the city of Fallujah when it was really, really nasty. And so he was in these overwatch missions, watching over the Marine teams. And as he's going around, he heard some fighting down on the ground. So he and his buddy ran down, and they were looking in the street, trying to find where this activity was. And he found a group of Marines clustered at the end of an alleyway. And he asked what was going on. They told him there was a group of Marines trapped in a house down the alley to the left. And down the alley to the right, directly across from the trapped Marines, was a house full of insurgents, and they were shooting at the Marines. So every time the Marines tried to leave the house, and get out of there, they were getting shot up. And so they were trapped. There was no way to get down there. So Chris, being the elder statesman of amongst the Marines there, grabbed a group of them and said, "Let's go down, and we're going to free these guys." And so they started marching down, and somehow, just as they started marching down this alley, an insurgent pops out of the house and starts gunning them down. As Chris said, he had us dead to rights. He should have had us all hosed down. But instead, he missed everyone. Apparently, the kickback from his, I guess it was an AK, was so strong that it knocked it up. So he just shot basically up and around them. It was almost like something out of Pulp Fiction, when the guy starts shooting and he shoots around Samuel L. Jackson. I don't know if you remember that scene.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
that's what it was like. It was basically, he made silhouettes of them. And then, of course, they dispatched with him relatively quickly. Then Chris basically regrouped and ran down the alley. Now, again, he thought that the Marines were with him on the second trip, just like they were on the first trip, but they hadn't heard him. It was just like Chris Choe. They hadn't heard him, so he was all alone as he ran down this alley. And what's worse is that Chris was a sniper, so he had this gun that was unbelievably accurate from a far distance. I mean, he could shoot over a mile away with extreme accuracy. But that type of gun is sort of the opposite thing from what you need when you're in close quarters combat, like he was there, fighting inside an alleyway. And so he had this long, unwieldy rifle that was not very good for these situations, but he was firing anyway. And then he ran out of rounds. He had to change his magazine, all while the insurgents are shooting at him. He's standing alone in this alleyway. He changes his magazine out, goes through that whole second magazine, changes out again, all while they're shooting at him. He is shooting back. He finally runs over and kicks in the door where the Marines are, and he's yelling, "Go, go, go, go." He kicks in the door. They run out. He's shooting at the insurgents' house, trying to keep some suppressive fire while the Marines run. They scurry out, and Chris is about to run back to where he started at the head of the alley, at where the rest of the Marines are, and he looks to his left, and there on the left is a Marine lying on the ground. Chris has no idea how he got there, because when he was coming down the alley, there was no Marine there, and all the Marines ran to the right. So he's puzzled by that to the end of his life. He was confused by that. But anyway, he sees this Marine. He was clearly shot up in his legs. So he grabs the Marine and starts dragging him down the alley. Well, as he's dragging him, the insurgents are just taking pot shots, right? I mean, this is like shooting proverbial fish in a barrel. And Chris is running with this guy, dragging him as fast as he can. As he's getting down the alley, the insurgents come out into the alley and start chasing him down the alley, shooting literally point blank. Chris, at this point, has no bullets left, and he can't shoot backwards with any accuracy. So he is just trying to haul ass, he said, all the way to the Marines. Bullets are whizzing by his head. The stucco on the alley walls is popping off by his head. And he said, that was one time he thought he was going to die. He said he was sucking wind. He said his legs were burning like he'd never felt before. And he was pulling this guy, and the insurgents are coming closer and closer and closer and closer. And finally, he eventually gets to a point and he sees the Marines, and the Marines see him. The Marines at the end of the alley who are waiting for him. They see him, and then they finally engage. And Chris carries the Marine all the way back and literally saved that man's life. Pretty incredible story.
What a story of heroism and doing what seems like the impossible.
It's intense. I mean, and when you hear him talk about it, it was pretty intense as well. I mean, I was dying, and there's other nuance that I didn't include for the sake of brevity, but it just goes deeper and deeper. I mean, it's a pretty fascinating, inspiring story about what a human can do under extreme conditions.
Yeah, absolutely, and just what an incredible story. I know the listeners here are really engaged and wanting to learn more. I certainly want to learn more about what these guys did, and just thank you for putting these stories together in your book.
This was my pleasure. I mean, this became a life mission. I mean, when you hear stories like Chris Choe's and Chris Kyle's, and that no one knows about them, and you learn about how these were good guys, with families and wives and kids, and they're good people, and you're sitting there saying, they're going to go home and be nobodies, I've got to change that. I've got to do something to change that. So it became a real mission for me.
Right. And what kind of takeaways would you like the audience to pull away from Chris Kyle's story here?
Well, the one thing about Chris Kyle that blows me away, and for those folks who don't know about Chris, Chris was the most lethal sniper in American military history, right? Think about that concept. It's a pretty incredible record. He earned multiple silver stars, multiple bronze stars with valor for his actions in combat, and those are unbelievably difficult to get. And he earned multiples of them. You know, five. I think it was 5 silver stars and bronze star medals with valor. I mean, that's just an incredible record, and other commendations as well. He was so effective against the Al Qaeda insurgents that they called him the Devil of Ramadi. They even put a bounty on his head for $80,000. Think about that, on his personal head. And this is my favorite thing. This is the Navy SEALs called him the legend. Wrap your head around that for a second. When the Navy SEALs are calling you the legend, you know you're the real deal, right? But here's the thing. I interviewed Chris for 8 hours. Right, that is a ton of questions. That is a ton of answers going back and forth, lots of talking. I emailed with him countless times. But get this, never, not once, did he mention any of those things. Now again, I don't know about you, but if I had done any of those things, I would have tweeted it like 100 times. I would have put it on Facebook, right? I would have tattooed it on my forehead that I had done these things, but not Chris, right? I mean, that type of humility is really overwhelming. And by the way, Chris is, the other guys are the same. The 9 that I profiled in valor, but also the other folks that I interviewed, they just don't talk about what they did. And that I respected so much.
Right, right. Today actually I was featured in Huffington Post, and I shared that, put that on Twitter, put that on Facebook.
Absolutely. I mean, when I get an article about my book, I put it on my Facebook page, I put it on my website. I do all kinds of tweeting and everything. I mean, absolutely, it's exactly what you're talking about. And these guys do things that are 100-fold more dangerous. I mean, 1,000 times more dangerous and more consequential in terms of the world, right? And they don't talk a whit. It's pretty incredible.
Absolutely. And what can we as civilians learn from these heroes, and how can we apply this into our own lives?
Well, I think there is that level of perspective that we were talking about, that maybe we need to take it down a notch on some of these things, throwing a fit with, someone, a long line at Starbucks or something like that. I mean, there's just a lot of anxiety in the world. And I think when we think about what these guys are going through, it really helps us step it down a little bit. And the humility that I was talking about, everyone's claiming credit for everything. And maybe we need to knock it down a bit and get a little perspective. But not only that, just in a more positive way, these guys have a brotherhood, a teamwork, a loyalty. I mean, however you want to characterize it, it's this concept of self-sacrifice for each other. And that is just mesmerizing to me. We in the civilian world, we don't have anything like that. And I tried to convey that in the stories of valor, exactly the depth of this brotherhood, this loyalty, what they would do for each other. I mean, they're literally diving into sniper's fire for each other. And I can't think of something more dangerous than that. And these guys are doing that sort of thing. And that's something I think we can learn from. Now, we're not going to be going, into sniper's fire. We're not going to be, in an IED explosion or anything like that. But we can maybe learn about, helping each other out a little bit less of the rat race, the cutthroat mentality of some of our professional interactions, and maybe it's a little bit of, we're all in this together here, folks. I think we can learn from these guys, because what happens is, when you have that level of dedication, that commitment, you're at your best. And that draws it out of you. And so I think that's what I learned, was that depth of commitment brings out your best. And for these guys, that manifested itself as loyalty for each other, brotherhood, teamwork for each other. I think we can have that manifest itself in a number of different ways. I think that's one of them, but I think we can have that come out in other ways, and that's what I would say is just find that thing that you love, find that thing that you can be so committed to, because that's where you'll be at your best.
Oh, right. And having read a number of these stories now from your book and other military books, it's like there are times when I'm working extremely hard and I may not hit the deadline. I'm tired. I want to go out and do have some fun, but I gotta work. And then I'll just think about like the Navy SEAL boot camp or any other Special Forces boot camp. It's like they're not sleeping, they're doing the hard work, they're pushing through. And so, looking back at those stories, it motivates me to push forward, to do the work that I need to do, because, that's the type of training and mentality that I want to apply into my own life.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's something I think we can take from all of them is they transcended the physical tribulations that they were going through in those moments, and we can definitely learn from that. I mean, they dug deeper and achieved excellence, and I think we can do the same thing. Many of the guys that I interviewed told me that when they went into boot camp, they were thinking they were pretty good, and then they quickly realized that they were dropped down a peg or two. But then in the rebuilding process that happens through boot camp is they realize that they can exceed their expectations. So in the stories of a Marine named James Hassel and an Army guy named Steve Sanford, they both talk about how boot camp, while difficult, actually made them better people in a host of different ways, and it kind of showed them that they can do far more than they thought they can do. And I think that's something we can learn from them, is that we can step up, we can overcome when things are difficult.
We could do more than we think we can do. It's like we don't even know our limits until we've truly been tested.
Absolutely, yeah, and these guys, they come in, they think they're pretty good, they think they're hot stuff, and they get to boot camp and get knocked down, but then they just exceed, and it's through that brotherhood, through that the working together, they realize that together they can do far more than any of them can do on their own.
Right. And now let's go into, Mark, like final thoughts on the book and how my audience can follow up with you.
One thing, by the way, one thing that's a cool aspect, and I'm happy to mention this, or you can mention whatever you want, is folks can go on the website and actually email directly with the heroes, like the guys I mentioned, Chris Choe, Steve Sanford, and all the guys, and for Chris Kyle obviously passed away, but I am sending it on to his family, and so folks can engage, and I know they have written back to people that have written in, so if folks want to share their views or say that a story touched them or something like that, these guys will engage with them.
Oh, that's really cool. I'll be sure to put that in the show notes, Mark. And so let's just dive in now. Like, what are your final thoughts on Valor, unsung heroes from Iraq, Afghanistan, and the home front?
Sure. Well, the stories themselves are just inspirational stories about what these guys did in extreme circumstances, and I think their optimism, their hard work, that just is so inspiring, and I think folks can just relate to that. But they're also, I mean, the other thing that I think I tried to do was tell not just this incredible story and these 9 incredible stories, but get deeper into what these guys were like and what made them tick. And I hope that emerges from the stories, and that readers get a feel for who they are as 3-dimensional humans, not just big guys with gun. And so there's the inspiration side, but there's also sort of this implicit call to action, which is these guys are doing these things. These men and women are doing these things on our behalf, and we need to welcome them back and help them when they come back here. And with things like the VA scandal, that's just a tragedy of epic proportions, and we need to do better as a community. And so I think there's this awareness that I'm trying to drum up a little bit, that folks can get an understanding of what they're doing over there, so that what we do here is a bit more helpful, a bit more aggressive in our efforts to help them when they come home. And the big thing, frankly, is jobs. We need to get these folks jobs when they come home. That really is a big help in their transition back.
Yeah, I agree. Can you elaborate a little bit on that VA scandal? I'm not familiar with that.
Well, the VA scandal is they basically had these ridiculously long waiting periods, these backlogs of thousands and thousands of veterans who were seeking service, and they were manipulating the data to cover it up at a number of different hospitals. And as a result of these bad backlogs, there were veterans who died, and recent veterans who died because of the VA backlog. And it's also lower level stuff. Like one of my heroes, a guy named Dan Foster, came back and the VA screwed up his paperwork, and as a result, he didn't get certain benefits. And he was about to the bank was about to foreclose on his house. He was about to be homeless because the VA screwed up his paperwork and didn't get it fixed for months and months and months and months. And Dan was in dire straits. And so this is a real problem, and we need to do better as a community to help these guys when they come home. I mean, the VA is supposed to be the government's response, the government's way of getting them back adjusted into society and helping their physical and mental wounds. And in many cases, they were just exacerbating those wounds.
All right. Well, thanks for sharing, Mark. I mean, these are topics, issues that I'm not aware of, and probably the average everyday person just isn't aware of either.
Yeah, well, that's one thing I was trying to do. I mean, I think Americans, guys like the listeners, to your show. I mean, I think they have an intellectual understanding of what these men and women are doing overseas. And what I was trying to do was fill the void between the intellectual understanding and the granular understanding, the nitty gritty of what guys are actually doing. It's one thing to say like, oh yeah, there are some heroes out there, but not being able to name one. What I was trying to do with this book was put them in their shoes so that they understood what guys like Chris Choe and Chris Kyle and James Hassel and Buck Doyle and all the others were doing, in those awful moments, so that when people talk about heroism, they have a vision of what that actually means.
All right, Mark. And how can my audience follow up with you moving forward?
Well, the book is available everywhere. It's on Amazon. It's on Barnes & Noble. It's in independent bookstores all around the country. You can also get it on my publisher's website, Roman and Littlefield. Any kind of information or links to all those things are on my website, markleegreenblatt.com, MarkLeeGreenblatt. And there's all kinds of info. There are pictures of the guys. There's more information about what the guys are doing now. There are, the updates since the book came out. And then the best thing, what I think is the coolest feature of my website, is I have a place. It's called Email a Hero, and readers can go on there and email directly with the heroes that I talked about today. All 9, either they or their families, you can email directly with them, and folks have written in, and I know the guys write back. I know they love hearing from listeners, from readers. So if you have folks that are interested in just conveying their thoughts, saying thank you, maybe one of the stories touched them on a personal level, I'm sure these guys love to hear from your listeners. So I would encourage everyone to go on markleegreenblatt.com and hit the email a hero tab and take it from there.
All right, Mark, thank you so much for the work that you do and raising awareness of the sacrifices our military makes. And I really appreciate your time and sharing these stories with my community. And by the way, some really good storytelling. I was really holding like the edge of my seat when you were talking. So
thank you so much, Andrew. I got to tell you, as a listener of Knowledge for Men, this is a real honor. I've listened for a long time. I've heard a lot of the podcasts, and I'm going to be excited to hear this one. This is a real honor for me, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. And all right, guys, that's going to wrap up episode 122 with Mark Lee Greenblatt. Do you feel stuck, alone, or like you're not getting the type of results you think you deserve? You put in all the hard work in your life, relationships, and business, but things just aren't getting any better? I've been there. That's how I started. That's where I was. I kept trying to improve my life, but nothing just seemed to give. I started to think that personal development was a joke. I felt like every month I was in the same place I was the previous month. But then I found something that just worked. I grew, my business grew, my relationships flourished, and everything around me just started to click. People started respecting me more, and I finally felt like I was becoming the man I wanted to be. I created a program to help guys get the same results in their life. Check out kfmline.com to learn how the Lion's Den can radically transform your life. Again, that's kfmline.com.